Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back, way back, over 3,000 years into the sun-drenched, reed-lined banks of the Nile, to explore something utterly fundamental to ancient Egyptian life: their beer. Imagine, if you will, the warm, dry air clinging to your skin, the distant murmur of the river, and the earthy aroma of, well, fermenting grains. You're standing not in a bustling modern brewery, but a simple, open-air workshop, perhaps near a granary, where the earliest whispers of this golden liquid are just beginning to form. You might even find yourself dodging a stray donkey, or perhaps a curious ibis pecking at spilled barley. It's a scene so different from your sparkling kitchen, so utterly devoid of stainless steel vats and computer-controlled temperatures, that it almost feels like a dream. And honestly, considering the hygiene standards of the day, you probably wouldn't survive a single sip of their freshest brew without a significant upset. Just a little reality check there. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always love to see how far these sleepy historical journeys travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins, as most good stories do, with the ingredients. You see, the ancient Egyptians didn't just stumble upon beer, they cultivated it, quite literally, from the very soil beneath their feet. The primary grain for their brewing endeavors was barley, a staple crop that thrived in the fertile Nile Delta. But it wasn't just any barley. We're talking about a hardy, ancient strain, likely a two-row barley, that would have been a far cry from the highly refined, hybridized varieties we use today. You might picture fields stretching to the horizon, shimmering gold under the relentless Egyptian sun, waiting for the annual inundation of the Nile to bring life-giving silt. But it wasn't only barley. Evidence suggests they also experimented with emmer wheat, another ancient grain that provided a slightly different flavor profile, perhaps a little more robust, a little less sweet. Think of it as their artisanal blend. This wasn't a choice driven by hipster trends or craft beer fads, but by agricultural availability and, perhaps, a desire for variety in their daily sustenance. Imagine yourself chewing on a handful of these raw grains, tough, earthy, unyielding. It's hard to imagine the transformation they would undergo, but the Egyptians, through trial and error, figured it out. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some scholars believe that the discovery of beer was less a deliberate invention and more a happy accident, perhaps a forgotten bowl of barley gruel left out in the rain, inoculated by wild yeast drifting on the desert breeze. It's a romantic notion, isn't it? The universe, conspiring to give humanity a buzz. While this theory is certainly charming, the sophistication of later brewing practices suggests a more intentional, if still empirical, development over millennia. Historians still argue whether the initial purpose of cultivating grains was solely for bread making, with beer as a secondary, perhaps even accidental, discovery, or if the intoxicating properties of fermented beverages were recognized early on and actively pursued. Was bread the foundation, or was beer the original liquid gold? It's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario, isn't it? But what is clear is that both bread and beer became inextricably linked in the very fabric of Egyptian daily life, a testament to their agricultural ingenuity and, perhaps, their profound appreciation for a good, calming brew. Once the barley and emmer were harvested, the next crucial step in this ancient brewing symphony was malting. Now, if you're picturing vast industrial kilns, gently toasting grains, banish that image from your mind. The Egyptian process was far simpler, more organic, and entirely reliant on the whims of the sun and the ever-present Nile water. You would have seen workers, perhaps you yourself would be among them, carefully spreading out the grains on flat, sun-baked surfaces. Imagine the golden kernels shimmering under the intense Egyptian sun, absorbing its warmth, waiting for their transformation. Then came the wetting. Water from the Nile, cool and life-giving, would be sprinkled over the grains. This wasn't a dousing, but a gentle, controlled moistening. The goal was to coax the grain into believing it was time to sprout, to trick it into releasing its natural enzymes. You'd see the grains begin to swell, to soften, and eventually, if you looked closely enough, tiny rootlets would start to emerge, delicate white tendrils reaching out. This was the magic of germination, the release of amylase enzymes that would later convert the complex starches within the grain into simpler, fermentable sugars. It's a process that sounds rather technical, but to the Egyptians, it was likely just another part of the natural rhythm of agriculture, a gentle unfolding of nature's bounty. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some evidence suggests they didn't even need to fully dry the malted grains. They might have used what's called green malt, which is still moist and active. This would have made the process even more immediate, reducing the need for extensive drying facilities. Imagine the earthy, slightly sweet smell of these damp, sprouting grains, mingling with the dry desert air. It's a scent that probably defined the atmosphere around their brewing sites. Once sufficiently germinated, the grains would then be lightly baked. And when I say baked, don't imagine a modern oven. We're talking about direct exposure to heat, often on hot stones or in rudimentary ovens. This baking served a dual purpose. It stopped the germination process, preserving those vital enzymes, and it added a subtle, often smoky flavor to the malt. This is where the distinct character of Egyptian beer truly began to develop. Depending on the heat and duration of this baking, the malt could range from very light to quite dark, influencing the final color and taste of the beer. You could almost envision the wisps of smoke curling upwards, carrying the scent of roasting grains into the clear blue sky. Historians still argue whether this baking was primarily for flavor development or simply to make the grains more brittle and easier to grind. Was it a culinary choice or a practical necessity? Perhaps a bit of both, a happy marriage of efficiency and taste. What we do know is that this malting process, simple as it was utterly essential. Without it, the starches would remain stubbornly complex, and the wild yeasts, no matter how eager, would have nothing substantial to feast upon. So, the sun, the water, and a bit of controlled heat transformed humble barley into the very heart of the ancient Egyptian brew. You're watching, or rather, feeling, the foundational alchemy of their daily sustenance unfold. With the malted grains now ready, the next step involved preparing them for the actual brewing. This wasn't about fancy milling machines or precise grinds. Instead, the Egyptians employed simpler, more manual methods. You'd likely see large, flat grinding stones, not unlike the ones used for grinding flour for bread. Imagine yourself kneeling, perhaps with a heavy stone roller, laboriously crushing the malted barley and emmer into a coarse meal. This wasn't about achieving a fine powder. Rather, the goal was to break open the grain husks, exposing the starches within to the water and enzymes that would follow. Think of it as a very rustic, very hands-on mortar and pestle operation, but on a larger scale. This coarse grinding was crucial because it allowed for better extraction of the sugars during the mashing process. If the grains were too finely ground, they could form a thick, impenetrable paste, making it difficult for the water to penetrate and for the wort, the sugary liquid that becomes beer, to be separated. Too coarse, and you wouldn't get enough sugar out. So, there was a delicate balance, likely learned through generations of trial and error, a tactile knowledge passed down from brewer to brewer. You'd feel the resistance of the grain under your hands, adjusting your pressure, instinctively knowing when the consistency was just right. Now, for the vessel itself. This is where things get truly ancient. Forget gleaming copper kettles or stainless steel tanks. The primary fermentation vessels for ancient Egyptian beer were often large, unglazed pottery jars. Imagine massive, earthy brown pots, probably standing waist-high, with wide mouths. These weren't just any pots. They were specifically designed for brewing, sometimes with porous walls that allowed for a very slow, subtle aeration, a sort of breathing for the developing brew. You can almost feel the rough, unglazed clay against your fingertips, cool to the touch despite the warmth of the sun. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some of these brewing vessels had a rough, internal surface intentionally left unpolished. This wasn't due to a lack of craftsmanship. Instead, these rough surfaces provided a perfect habitat for wild yeasts and bacteria to cling to. Essentially, the pot itself was a living part of the brewery, contributing its own unique microbial signature to each batch. This meant that every brew made in that particular pot would have a slightly different character, a subtle house flavor, imparted by the resident microscopic community. It's like their own built-in, pre-inoculated sourdough starter, but for beer. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians deliberately inoculated their brews with yeast, perhaps by reusing vessels or adding a bit of dregs from a previous batch, or if fermentation was largely spontaneous, relying on wild yeasts naturally present in the air and on the grains. Was it a controlled process, or more of a hopeful waiting game? Given the consistency of their beer production over millennia, it seems highly likely they had some understanding of starter cultures, even if they didn't comprehend the microbiology behind it. You'd simply add a bit of the old to the new, a practical tradition passed down through generations. These simple clay pots were the silent workhorses of the ancient Egyptian brewing industry, holding the promise of a refreshing, nourishing, and often intoxicating beverage within their humble, earthen walls. With the coarsely ground malted grains in their humble pottery vessels, the next step involved creating what brewers today call the mash. This is where the magic truly begins, as the starches are converted into fermentable sugars. You'd pour hot, but not boiling, water over the grain meal. Imagine the steam rising, carrying the warm, earthy scent of the malt, as you stir the mixture with a large wooden paddle. The consistency wouldn't be thin and watery, nor would it be a dry paste. Think more along the lines of a thick porridge, a rich, grainy gruel. This was the foundation of the beer, a nourishing blend that was often consumed as a staple food in its own right, before it even had a chance to ferment. The temperature of this mash was crucial. Too hot, and you'd denature the enzymes needed for starch conversion. Too cold, and they wouldn't activate efficiently. The Egyptians, without thermometers or precise scientific understanding, relied on centuries of empirical knowledge, passed down through generations. You'd simply know, by instinct and practice, the right warmth for the water, perhaps judging it by touch, or by the speed at which the steam rose. This intuitive knowledge was the cornerstone of their brewing success. Now, here's where the sweetening comes in, but not in the way you might expect. While the malting process created sugars from starches, ancient Egyptian beer was often intentionally sweetened further. But not with refined sugar, which didn't exist, nor even honey, which was precious. Instead, they commonly used dates. Imagine the sticky, sweet fruit, perhaps mashed into a paste, or simply tossed into the mash alongside the grains. These dates provided an additional source of fermentable sugars, boosting the alcohol content and adding a distinctive, fruity note to the finished beer. You can almost taste the subtle sweetness, a counterpoint to the earthy grains. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some analyses of ancient beer residues have even found traces of other fruits, like figs or even spices and herbs. While dates were common, it suggests that Egyptian brewers, much like modern craft brewers, experimented with different flavorings to create unique batches. Perhaps a special brew for a festival, or a particular blend favored by a local dignitary. Historians still argue whether these additions were primarily for flavor, for preservation, or even for medicinal properties. Was it about taste, shelf life, or health? It's likely a combination of all three, reflecting the holistic view ancient cultures often had of their food and drink. As the mash sat, the enzymes from the malt would tirelessly work, breaking down the complex starches into simpler sugars like maltose. This process, known as saccharification, was the silent alchemy happening within those humble pots. You wouldn't see it, but you'd know it was happening, slowly transforming a thick, unfermented porridge into a sweet liquid, ready for the next stage of its journey. This sweet, unfermented liquid, or wort, was a source of nourishment in itself, consumed by many as a vital part of their daily diet, a testament to its dual role as both food and potential beverage. So, you have this thick, date-sweetened mash, quietly converting its starches into sugars. Now, it's essential to understand that beer in ancient Egypt wasn't just a celebratory drink. It was a fundamental pillar of their daily nutrition, as important as bread, and often, quite literally, made from the same ingredients. Imagine starting your day not with a cup of coffee or tea, but with a nourishing bowl or beaker of this slightly fermented, often thick, beer bread hybrid. It was a caloric powerhouse, providing energy, carbohydrates, and even some protein and B vitamins. You'd feel the satisfying warmth in your stomach, readying you for a day of work under the hot sun. This wasn't the clear, effervescent lager you might enjoy today. Far from it. Ancient Egyptian beer was typically cloudy, often quite thick, resembling a thin porridge or gruel. You might even find bits of grain floating in it, a testament to its unfiltered, wholesome nature. It was often consumed directly from the brewing vessel or poured into simple pottery bowls or cups. Imagine tipping back a clay cup, feeling the texture of the liquid, a taste that was likely earthy, subtly sweet from the dates, and with a mild tang from the fermentation. Here's a quirky tidbit. Because of its nutritional value and often low alcohol content, some estimates put it around 1 to 2% ABV, similar to kvass or kombucha. It was even given to children. Yes, toddlers might have been enjoying a diluted version of this ancient brew. This wasn't about getting them tipsy, but about providing a safe, nutritious, and calorie-rich drink, especially in a world where water sources could be contaminated. It's a concept that might raise modern eyebrows, but to the Egyptians, it was simply practical nourishment. You'd watch a child happily sip from their small cup, utterly unaware of the historical significance of their beverage. Historians still argue whether the primary reason for drinking beer was for its nutritional benefits, for its hydrating qualities in a hot climate, or for its mild intoxicating effects that offered a brief escape from the rigors of daily life. Was it food, drink, or mood enhancer? It was likely all three, depending on the strength of the brew and the occasion. For the average laborer, it was fuel. For a priest, perhaps a conduit to the divine. And for everyone, a familiar comfort. Imagine the bustling marketplace, where alongside baskets of bread and fresh vegetables, you'd find vendors ladling out generous portions of this life-sustaining liquid. It was ubiquitous, present at every level of society, from the humblest peasant's meal to the most elaborate temple feast. This fundamental integration into their diet meant that the production of beer wasn't just a niche industry. It was a central pillar of their agricultural economy, a constant, gentle hum of activity that underpinned their entire civilization. You'd hear the rhythmic sounds of grain being ground, water being poured, and perhaps the faint, yeasty scent wafting on the breeze, a quiet testament to the essential role of this golden liquid. Beyond its role as a dietary staple, beer in ancient Egypt also functioned as a crucial element of their economic and social fabric. Imagine not a paycheck, but a daily ration of beer. That's right, for many laborers, especially those working on massive state projects like the pyramids or temples, beer wasn't just a refreshment, it was a form of payment, a liquid salary. You'd line up at the end of a long, arduous day, your muscles aching from hauling stone or digging canals, and receive your allotted portion of this nourishing brew. It was a tangible reward, a caloric incentive, and a practical way to fuel a massive workforce. This beer wage system wasn't just for manual laborers. Even skilled artisans and scribes might have received part of their compensation in beer, alongside grain and other goods. It speaks volumes about the value placed on this beverage, elevating it from a mere drink to a recognized unit of economic exchange. You can almost hear the clinking of pottery vessels as rations were distributed, a sound that signaled the end of a hard day's work. But beer's influence stretched beyond the workplace. It was a social lubricant, much like it is today, albeit in a far more fundamental sense. Imagine gatherings in humble mud-brick homes, where families would share a large jar of beer, discussing the day's events, sharing stories, and simply relaxing together. It was a unifier, a drink that bridged social strata, though certainly, the elite would have access to finer, perhaps more potent, brews. You'd see people laughing, conversing, the mild effects of the alcohol perhaps loosening tongues and easing tensions. Here's a quirky tidbit. Ancient Egyptians had a variety of proverbs and sayings about beer, reflecting its pervasive presence in their culture. Some cautioned against excessive consumption, while others celebrated its joys. One text describes a man who, having drunk too much, makes a speech, but his body is not with him. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It suggests that even in ancient times, the consequences of overindulgence were well understood. Historians still argue whether the concept of a beer wage was primarily a logistical solution for a non-monetary economy, a paternalistic system to ensure worker sustenance, or a clever way to control the workforce through regular distributions. Was it about efficiency, welfare, or control? It was likely a blend of all these factors, showcasing the sophisticated, if often brutal, pragmatism of the ancient Egyptian state. Regardless of the underlying motivations, the fact remains that beer was deeply embedded in their economic structure, a silent partner in the construction of their monumental civilization. You're witnessing the practical, everyday power of this golden liquid, fueling both bodies and the very foundations of society. In many historical accounts of ancient societies, the roles of women are often overlooked or relegated to the domestic sphere. But when it comes to brewing beer in ancient Egypt, women held a surprisingly prominent and respected position. Imagine stepping into an Egyptian household, and you're likely to find the women of the family, from the mistress of the house to her daughters and servants, actively involved in the beer-making process. This wasn't just a task, it was often their domain, a skill passed down through generations. You'd see their hands, accustomed to grinding grains and kneading dough, expertly handling the brewing vessels, their movements rhythmic and practiced. In fact, the earliest brewers in ancient Egypt were almost exclusively women. There are countless depictions in tomb paintings and reliefs showing women at various stages of beer production. They are shown crushing grains, mixing the mash, and even tending to the fermentation. This wasn't a hidden activity, but a visible and essential part of their daily life and contribution to the household economy. You might observe a woman, perhaps a priestess, carefully overseeing a batch intended for religious offerings, or a housewife ensuring her family's daily supply. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some texts even refer to female brewers as beer ladies or brew mistresses, indicating a recognized and respected profession. While large-scale breweries eventually emerged, often run by men, the home-based brewing of beer remained largely in the hands of women for centuries. It highlights a fascinating aspect of ancient Egyptian gender roles, where certain essential crafts were seen as inherently female. It contrasts sharply with many other ancient cultures where brewing became a male-dominated trade much earlier. Historians still argue whether women's prevalence in brewing was primarily due to its close association with bread making, which was undeniably a female domain, or if there was a deeper, perhaps ritualistic, connection between women and the creation of this life-giving beverage. Was it practical synergy or sacred tradition? Perhaps it was a combination, as the lines between daily sustenance and spiritual significance often blurred in ancient Egypt. What is clear is that women were not just passive consumers of beer. They were its active creators, the quiet force behind one of Egypt's most vital industries. You'd witness the scene, perhaps a grandmother teaching her granddaughter the precise technique for stirring the mash, or a group of women chatting as they patiently monitor the fermenting vessels. The rhythmic sounds of their work, the gentle hum of conversation, and the earthy aroma of the brewing beer would fill the air, creating a truly sensory experience. It was a communal activity, a bond formed over the shared creation of this essential drink, a testament to the quiet power and ingenuity of women in ancient Egypt. Beyond its daily consumption and economic significance, beer held a profound place in the spiritual and ritualistic life of ancient Egyptians. Imagine the flickering lamplight illuminating a temple inner sanctum, or the morning sun glinting off offerings laid before a deity. You would find beer, not just as a casual offering, but as a sacred libation, poured out to appease the gods, honor the dead, and ensure the continued prosperity of the land. It was seen as a gift from the gods, a divine substance that bridged the gap between the mortal and the divine. Beer was often offered to deities like Osiris, the god of the afterlife and resurrection, and to Hathor, the goddess of joy, love, and, significantly, drunkenness. You can almost envision priests and priestesses, with solemn faces, pouring out streams of beer onto altars, the liquid slowly soaking into the ground, a symbolic act of nourishment for the divine. This wasn't just a simple gesture. It was a deeply meaningful interaction, a way to maintain cosmic order and ensure the favor of the powerful pantheon. Here's a quirky tidbit. The myth of the destruction of mankind involves the goddess Hathor almost annihilating humanity. Ra, seeking to prevent this, ordered large quantities of beer to be dyed red with ochre, making it resemble blood. Hathor, upon drinking this blood beer, became intoxicated and fell asleep, thus abandoning her destructive spree. It's a vivid, slightly humorous story that highlights beer's association with both power and pacification. and perhaps offers a cheeky ancient explanation for a hangover. Historians still argue whether the ritualistic consumption of beer was primarily for its symbolic meaning as a life-giving fluid, for its intoxicating effects that could induce altered states of consciousness, or as a communal act that fostered social cohesion during religious ceremonies. Was it sacred symbolism, spiritual intoxication, or social bonding? It was likely all three, depending on the specific ritual and the strength of the beer involved. For the ancient Egyptians, the sacred and the mundane were often intertwined, and beer, a staple of daily life, naturally found its place in their deepest spiritual practices. You would also find beer accompanying the deceased into the afterlife. Tombs often contained jars of beer, intended to sustain the departed on their journey through the underworld. Imagine the meticulous care with which these jars were prepared, sealed, and placed within the tomb, a final act of devotion and provision. This belief underscores the profound importance of beer. It wasn't just for this life, but for the eternal journey as well. You're witnessing a beverage transcend mere sustenance to become a vital component of spiritual survival, a gentle hum of ancient faith carried on the yeasty scent of beer. It might seem strange to associate beer with ancient medicine, but in a world without modern pharmaceuticals, people often looked to what was available for healing. And for the ancient Egyptians, beer, particularly certain types, was considered to have therapeutic properties. Imagine a person suffering from a minor ailment, perhaps a cough or a stomach upset. You might see them being offered a specific concoction, with beer as its base, believed to alleviate their symptoms. This wasn't just a folk remedy. Some texts even describe beer as an ingredient in various prescriptions. The nutritional content of beer, particularly its vitamins and minerals, even if they didn't understand the science behind it, would have made it a valuable supplement in a diet that could sometimes be lacking. Think of it as an ancient superfood drink, especially for those who were ill or recovering. It was often safer to drink than plain water, which could be contaminated, providing hydration as well as sustenance. You can almost feel the gentle warmth of the liquid as it goes down, offering a small comfort to the ailing. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medical papyri mention beer as a carrier for various medicinal herbs and substances. Instead of simply crushing herbs and ingesting them, they would be mixed into beer, making them more palatable and perhaps aiding in their absorption. For instance, remedies for digestive issues or even certain skin conditions might have involved a beer-based poultice or drink. It's a fascinating glimpse into their integrated approach to health, where food, drink, and medicine often blurred. Historians still argue whether the perceived medicinal benefits of beer were due to its actual pharmacological properties, its placebo effect, or simply its ability to provide hydration and calories to a sick person. Was it the beer itself, the belief in its power, or just good old rehydration? It was likely a complex interplay of all these factors. What is clear is that the Egyptians certainly believed in beer's healing potential, incorporating it into their early pharmacopoeia. Imagine a physician, or perhaps a wise elder, preparing a specific brew for a patient. They would carefully select the ingredients, perhaps adding particular herbs known for their calming or purifying properties. The process would be slow, deliberate, a quiet act of care. You're witnessing a culture that saw its staple beverage not just as food or drink, but as a tool for well-being, a gentle, golden potion offering a moment of relief in a world without aspirin. Now, let's talk about the tools of the trade. If you're envisioning gleaming copper kettles and precise measuring instruments, you're quite far off. The ancient Egyptian brewer's toolkit was remarkably simple, yet effective, relying on ingenuity and the natural resources at hand. Imagine yourself squatting by a large, shallow basin, perhaps carved from stone or simply a depression in the ground lined with clay. This might have served as a rudimentary mixing vat for the mash. You'd likely be stirring with a sturdy wooden paddle, worn smooth from countless batches. For grinding the malted grains, as we discussed, you'd be using hand mills, often consisting of two stones, a larger, flat-based stone, and a smaller, rounded upper stone used for crushing. Imagine the rhythmic thud and scrape of these stones as you laboriously break down the kernels, your muscles aching slightly from the repetitive motion. This was a slow, manual process requiring patience and strength, far removed from the whirring of modern grinders. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some archaeological finds suggest that in larger, more organized breweries, they might have even used rudimentary sieves, perhaps woven from reeds or coarse cloth, to separate the spent grains from the wort. This would have helped to produce a slightly clearer beer, though still far from the pristine clarity we expect today. It shows an early understanding of filtration, a desire to refine their product even with limited technology. You can almost see the thick, cloudy wort slowly dripping through the makeshift filter, leaving behind the coarser bits. For heating, their brewhouse would have been very open air. Large pottery vessels, sometimes directly placed over a fire, or perhaps within a simple clay oven, would have been used to heat the water for the mash, and possibly to gently cook the beer bread that formed the initial base. You'd smell the smoke, feel the warmth radiating from the fire, and keep a watchful eye on the temperature, judging it by the bubbles on the surface or by the simple immersion of a hand. Historians still argue whether the consistent quality of Egyptian beer over millennia implies a strict adherence to traditional methods, or if there was a continuous process of innovation and refinement of their simple tools and techniques. Was it static tradition or gradual improvement? It was likely a blend, with fundamental practices remaining consistent while minor tweaks and efficiencies were introduced over time. These simple, earthy tools, stone grinders, wooden paddles, and clay pots, were the silent enablers of Egypt's brewing prowess. They weren't just implements. They were extensions of the brewer's hands, imbued with the cumulative knowledge of generations. You're watching the quiet dedication of ancient artisans, crafting their daily sustenance with nothing more than natural materials and an intuitive understanding of the subtle alchemy of fermentation. The sounds would have been minimal: the scrape of stone, the gentle bubbling of fermentation, and perhaps the murmur of conversation, all contributing to the soothing rhythm of the ancient brewing process. Just as modern breweries offer a spectrum of lagers, alesh, and stouts, the ancient Egyptians, despite their simple methods, produced a surprising variety of beers. Imagine walking through an ancient Egyptian market, and you might encounter different grades or types of beer, each with its own specific purpose and taste. This wasn't a world of craft beer menus, but there were distinct differences, likely understood and appreciated by the populace. You'd probably discern varying colors and consistencies, even without a label. Some beers would have been thick and dark, more akin to a liquid bread, rich in calories, and perhaps with a strong, earthy flavor. These were likely the daily staples, the workhorse brews consumed by laborers and families alike, designed primarily for nourishment. You can almost feel the hearty texture, a dense liquid meal that would stick to your ribs and fuel your day under the hot sun. This was the dark, brooding stout of ancient Egypt. Then there were lighter brews, perhaps less viscous, with a cleaner taste. These might have been produced for specific occasions, or for those who preferred a less heavy beverage. The variation in color and consistency would have depended on factors like the type of grain used. Emmer wheat often produced a lighter beer than barley, the extent of malting, and the duration and temperature of the baking process. A lighter bake would yield a paler malt, and thus a lighter beer. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some analyses suggest that certain Egyptian beers even had a slightly tart or sour note, due to the presence of lactic acid bacteria. This might sound off-putting to modern palates used to crisp, clean beers, but in ancient times, this sourness was likely appreciated, perhaps even a sign of freshness or a desired flavor profile, much like sourdough bread today. It would have added a refreshing tang, especially in the hot climate. Historians still argue whether the perceived types of beer were a result of intentional brewing choices, or simply variations inherent in their less controlled processes. Was it deliberate recipe diversification or accidental variation? It was probably a bit of both. Over time, consistent methods would have led to predictably different results, allowing brewers to recreate specific styles. You're sensing the subtle nuances, the accidental artistry of ancient fermentation. Even the alcohol content would have varied significantly. Some brews were likely very low in alcohol, almost non-intoxicating, consumed freely throughout the day. Others, perhaps reserved for festivals or religious ceremonies, could have been stronger, intended to induce a more profound effect. You're stepping into a world where beer was not a monolithic beverage, but a multifaceted liquid, serving a diverse array of purposes from simple sustenance to spiritual transcendence, all flowing from those same humble grains and the gentle art of the ancient brewer. Let's piece together the entire, slow-paced journey of beer from the field to the fermentation vessel, as you would have experienced it. It begins in the golden fields, where you watch the barley and emmer growing tall under the relentless Egyptian sun. Harvest is a communal effort, cutting the stalks by hand, gathering the precious grains. Then comes the malting, spreading those grains out on the sun-warmed earth, sprinkling them with Nile water, waiting patiently for the tiny rootlets to emerge. You'd feel the subtle stickiness of the germinating grain on your fingers. After malting, the grains would be lightly baked, sometimes over a gentle fire, adding that characteristic smoky nuance. You'd inhale the earthy, toasted aroma, a comforting scent that signaled the next stage. Then, the arduous process of grinding. Imagine the rhythmic thud scrape of the hand mill, your arms tiring as you crush the malted kernels into a coarse meal, a texture not unlike modern cracked wheat. This wasn't a quick task, it was a meditation in repetition. Next, the mashing. You'd carefully add the hot water to the ground malt, stirring vigorously with a long wooden paddle to create that thick, nourishing gruel. The steam would rise, carrying the combined scents of malt and water, hinting at the sweetness to come. If dates or other fruits were to be added, this would be the stage. You'd feel the warmth of the mash, a living, transforming substance. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some researchers believe that the Egyptians might have baked small loaves of this raw, unfermented beer bread, lightly cooked, and then crumbled them into the mash. This would have provided a stable base for fermentation and introduced natural yeasts. It's a genius workaround, essentially creating a pre-fermented starter culture in a solid form. You might see a small, dry, crumbly loaf being broken apart and dropped into the thick liquid, sinking slowly to the bottom. Historians still argue whether the entire process was always done in a single, large vessel, or if there were separate stages for mashing and fermentation, with the liquid being transferred. Was it a one-pot wonder or a multi-stage production? Evidence suggests both approaches were used, depending on the scale and intent of the brewing. Finally, after the mash was prepared, the crucial part, fermentation. This is where the wild yeasts, either lingering in the porous pottery or introduced from a previous batch, would begin their quiet feast on the sugars. You wouldn't see much, perhaps just a few bubbles slowly rising to the surface, a gentle fizz. But you'd feel the subtle warmth emanating from the vessel as the metabolic activity of the yeast slowly, gently, transformed the sweet wort into beer. The air around the pots would gradually fill with a yeasty, slightly alcoholic aroma, a sign that the magic was happening. You're witnessing a slow, almost imperceptible alchemy, a testament to ancient patience and natural processes, turning humble grains into the golden liquid that fueled an empire. Once the fermentation process was underway, ensuring a good quality brew, or at least a consistent one, required a subtle understanding of the process. For the ancient Egyptians, this wasn't about laboratory tests or precise gravity readings. It was about observation, smell, and perhaps even taste. Imagine yourself peering into one of those large clay vessels, perhaps watching the bubbles slowly rise, or noticing the subtle shift in aroma. You'd know, instinctively, that the beer was progressing as it should. The brewer's senses were their primary quality control tools. A distinct yeasty aroma, a certain level of bubbling, or a particular thickness of the head on the beer would all be indicators of a successful fermentation. If the smell turned sour or foul, or if the bubbling stopped too soon, it would signal a problem. You'd probably learn to distinguish between the various stages of fermentation by the subtle changes in the air around the vessels. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some analyses of ancient residues suggest that certain batches might have been intentionally soured or inoculated with specific bacteria, perhaps for preservation or for desired flavor profiles. While we often strive for sterile environments in modern brewing, the ancient world embraced a more wild, microbial approach. So, what might seem like a fault to us could have been a deliberate choice for them. It's a delightful thought, isn't it? That their bad beer was actually quite good. Historians still argue whether the consistency of ancient Egyptian beer across different sites and time periods suggests a shared, standardized brewing process. or if local variations and individual brewers' preferences led to a wide range of different beers. Was there a universal recipe, or were there countless regional specialties? It was likely a spectrum, with core methods ensuring a basic level of consistency, but with plenty of room for subtle, localized differences. The final stage of quality control would have been the taste test. Imagine a small cup being filled from the vessel, perhaps offered first to the head brewer or the household mistress. They would sip slowly, evaluating the flavor, the body, and the overall character of the beer. Was it too thin? Too sweet? Just right? This subjective assessment, refined over generations, was the ultimate arbiter of a good brew. You're witnessing a system of quality assurance based on tradition, sensory experience, and a deep, ingrained knowledge of the craft, ensuring that the golden liquid that fueled their civilization was fit for consumption day in and day out. While we've been imagining a somewhat rustic, perhaps household-level brewing operation, it's important to remember that ancient Egypt also had breweries of a much larger scale. Imagine the stark contrast. On one hand, a small, quiet corner of a mud brick home where a family brews its daily rations. On the other, the vast, bustling complexes near temples or royal estates where beer was produced in enormous quantities. You'd see dozens, perhaps hundreds, of large fermentation vats arranged in neat rows, bubbling away under the watchful eyes of supervisors. These large-scale breweries, often associated with temples or the pharaoh's administration, were industrial operations by ancient standards. They required a significant workforce, specialized facilities, and a more standardized process to ensure consistent output. The beer produced here would not only supply the vast number of temple personnel and workers on monumental projects, but also be used for ritualistic offerings and distribution to the populace. You can almost hear the low hum of activity, the clatter of pottery, and the constant flow of grains and water. Here's a quirky tidbit. Archaeological excavations at sites like Hierakonpolis have uncovered what are believed to be some of the earliest large-scale breweries, dating back as far as 3700 BC. These sites reveal multiple large vats, some capable of holding thousands of liters, suggesting a capacity for mass production that far exceeded household needs. It's like discovering the world's first beer factory, a testament to their early organizational prowess. Historians still argue whether the development of these large-scale breweries was driven primarily by the need to feed and pay a massive workforce, by the demands of religious institutions for vast quantities of offerings, or by the pharaoh's desire to centralize control over a vital commodity. Was it practical necessity, religious piety, or state power? It was likely a confluence of all these factors, each feeding into the growth of increasingly sophisticated brewing operations. The difference between royal breweries and common pots was not just about scale, it was also about quality and purpose. While a peasant's daily beer might be thick and nutritious, a brew destined for a royal feast or a high-temple ritual would likely be finer, perhaps clearer, and potentially stronger. You're observing the ancient world's version of a craft brewery versus a mass production facility, each fulfilling a distinct role in the complex tapestry of Egyptian society. The air in these larger operations would be thick with the sweet, yeasty aroma, a constant reminder of the golden liquid flowing through the veins of their civilization. As our journey through ancient Egyptian beer production draws to a close, you're left with a deeper appreciation for this golden liquid's enduring legacy. Imagine the countless generations, stretching back into the mists of prehistory, who relied on this simple yet vital brew. From the earliest accidental fermentations to the meticulously managed temple breweries, beer was not just a drink. It was a cornerstone of their civilization, a silent witness to millennia of human endeavor. Its impact resonated through every aspect of their lives, fueling the laborers who built the pyramids, nourishing families in their homes, providing a safe and vital source of hydration, and even bridging the gap between mortals and the divine. You've seen how its production was deeply interwoven with agriculture, technology, social structure, and religious belief. It wasn't merely a commodity, but a cultural touchstone, shaping daily rhythms and grand narratives alike. Here's a quirky tidbit. The yeast strains used by ancient Egyptian brewers might still exist today, dormant in ancient residues or thriving in specific, niche environments. Modern scientists are even attempting to recreate these ancient beers, using archaeological evidence, and sometimes even isolated yeast from ancient artifacts. Imagine raising a glass to a brew whose lineage stretches back thousands of years, a taste of history itself. Historians still argue whether the continuous, millennia-long production of beer contributed to the stability and longevity of ancient Egyptian society, or if it was simply a reflection of an already stable and well-organized culture. Was it a cause, or a symptom, of their enduring success? It was likely a symbiotic relationship, with the reliable availability of beer supporting societal structure, and a stable society enabling consistent beer production. The gentle art of brewing beer in ancient Egypt wasn't just a process. It was a reflection of their ingenuity, their adaptability, and their profound connection to the land and its bounty. You're now carrying the knowledge of this quiet, persistent tradition, a soft hum of history that reminds you of the simple, yet powerful, things that sustain us. As you drift now, imagine the gentle current of the Nile, carrying the faint, sweet scent of fermenting grain on the night air. The sounds of ancient Egypt begin to soften around you. The distant splash of a paddle, the quiet murmuring of voices, the subtle sizzle of a fire. Feel the warmth of the sun-baked earth beneath you, and the slow, rhythmic breath of a world that has long since passed. The ancient brewers have finished their work for the day. Their pots stand silent, holding the promise of tomorrow's nourishment. Let the quiet hum of history, the gentle ebb and flow of a world powered by sun, water, and grain, lull you further into comfort. Your journey through the past is winding down, leaving you with only the soft, warm glow of ancient stories. Close your eyes, let your thoughts float away, and allow the quiet mysteries of the past to guide you into a restful sleep.